the largely peaceful demonstration that occurred yesterday evening and afternoon. What we understand at this time is that about 6 o'clock yesterday afternoon, a large group of demonstrators arrived at the state capitol following the announcement of the charging decisions in Louisville, Kentucky. That group gathered there. There were some speeches that were delivered at that location. About 7 o'clock, that group, again remaining very peaceful, began to march through the downtown Denver area. And then ultimately, a couple hours later, returned to the Capitol area. At about 9 o'clock, we did have some agitators that began spray painting graffiti. There was also another incident in which a vehicle had some encounter with a group of protesters or demonstrators and had to drive away from that situation. We also had a couple of instances in which individuals who were possessed with firearms were contacted. Both of those individuals were taken into custody and those weapons were recovered. Is there any specific questions that I can answer? Yes, sir.
Were there any police blockades in the area?
Yes, and so relative to the car that ended up engaging those protesters, despite our best efforts to try to keep traffic diverted away from the group of protesters, there was a vehicle that somehow made its way onto Lincoln from 14th Avenue and seemed to see that there were protesters ahead of them, pulled over, and then was surrounded. And then what we can see from the video is that the individual in that car began to be threatened. I think that the vehicle was being kicked, and then that individual eventually kind of worked their way out of that situation and was chased by the protesters. We were able to view that situation as it was occurring on our Halo cameras, and we were able to vector in officers to stop that vehicle shortly after that. And we were able to stop that individual, take a statement from them, identify what they were doing there. We were able to verify that they were not drunk. And once we got their information, verified that they weren't drunk, we released them with the vehicle. We're still investigating that incident to determine the cause and determine if there were any appropriate criminal charges, and that case will ultimately be presented to the district attorney.
Did he drive around in the blockade? Was he let by?
Well, what it appears as though they drove through an intersection that was not manned. There's attempts to divert traffic well ahead of where the protest is occurring, or where the group of demonstrators has collected, and it looks as though they were able to kind of find a hole in that and drive through an area where the protesters were.
Can you talk about the challenge of blocking off roads, and has that changed how you guys handle protests as far as wanting to have a smaller presence of police officers near the group of protesters, or just what is the challenge that you guys face with, because we've seen cars,
Sure.
Similar situations pop up like this,
Sure.
not only in Denver, but overall.
Sure. Well, the challenge certainly is that we want to allow for people to peacefully demonstrate and protest. We also understand that there are large numbers that gather at these protests that cause quite a bit of traffic disruption, but we want those demonstrators to be safe. We also want the motoring public to be safe. So we do our best to block traffic so that traffic doesn't drive into that situation. Certainly protecting them from some sort of careless situation, but also preventing cars from being surrounded or something like that. So it is a challenge, being able to block traffic, ahead of them and behind them, so that people don't drive up on them or turn into the direction that they're going.
And then any advice for a driver if they're caught in a situation like that?
Yeah, so certainly, as you're driving, I would pay close attention to the direction that you're going. If you see traffic stopped ahead, you might want to turn off. If you see people that have taken over the roadway, it would be best to turn away from that situation. In the event that you someone is blocking you or you're surrounded by people, our advice is to stay in the car, lock your doors, do not engage those demonstrators. And if you truly feel threatened, call 911. And if there's an avenue of escape that's provided to you, whether it means backing up, even on a one-way street, back away from that situation, or often it's just a demonstration, and ultimately they will allow you to pass in time. But certainly, we certainly don't advocate driving into those or driving through those groups of people.
What about the people that are in the streets? Particularly in this case, were they would you consider them agitators? Could they face any charges? And
well, I don't think it's fair to characterize everybody that was in the street as an agitator. I mean, certainly everybody was peacefully demonstrating for the most part. I think that's important to say. But when that vehicle had pulled over, there were individuals that seemed to be engaging with that person kicking the doors, making them certainly feel threatened. And so we understand the need to demonstrate and march in the roadway, and we support that. We do our best to protect those people, but we don't advocate people engaging in the motoring public and creating a threatening situation.
What was the driving?
Oh.
Sorry.
This is Ken Payne, Denver.
Yes.
Can you got more details on the two folks who had firearms? You said they were both arrested. Are they still in custody? What kind of guns were they that were confiscated? And is there any sense of sort of like were they brandishing those guns? I guess when they were arrested.
So my understanding, both of the handguns were legal firearms. Both of the individuals had concealed weapons permits to legally possess those firearms. There was one individual who did have his weapon out. We're looking into that situation. We were not able to find a victim who indicated that they felt threatened by that. As soon as we engaged that individual, he did set the weapon on the ground and submit to arrest. Both of those individuals, both of the guns are still in our custody, and both of those individuals were cited for having magazine capacities that are above the legal limit. Yes, sir.
Any injuries reported from last night, this incident?
Excuse me?
Any injuries?
No injuries at all.
Do you guys believe that the driver had intent to harm anyone?
I don't believe so. Having looked at the video, it appears as though they sort of inadvertently turned into this area where the protesters were, and then pulled over so that they wouldn't run over anybody in front of them, and then got surrounded. And it appears as though they were frightened and took the opportunity to escape when it was presented to them. Again, we're still looking into that, and that case will be presented to the district attorney.
You guys have already looked at some evidence of the Halo camera.
Yes.
There's also helicopter video.
That's correct.
Is there any other piece of evidence that maybe you're still looking into that could change sort of the mindset that you have on this case right now as far as gun charges?
Well, certainly. The written statement was obtained from the individual, and we are certainly looking at that individual to identify whether or not he just happened into the area or whether he intentionally drove into that area.
did he call 911? And is he cooperating?
He's cooperating, certainly. There was not a 911 call. We certainly saw it on Halo. We were preparing to respond, but then he was able to extricate himself before we made our response. But we did intercept him very soon after that.
What is your advice to protesters about going into the streets? And if they are not going to face any criminal charges, does that embolden them to keep doing this? This has happened 3 times in the past couple of months in the metro area.
Well, again, we understand, the need and the desire to demonstrate lawfully, and sort of the tone and tenor of these protests recently have involved, taking over the street, moving in mass, into downtown Denver and such. And we will continue to allow that. We will continue to block traffic so that they can safely, walk into the downtown area and walk on Denver city streets. But we certainly don't advocate, again, them threatening motorists that get trapped because they're not able to turn around or be diverted by our law enforcement officers.
Anybody else?
Chief, just real quick, you mentioned that the people with the guns had license to carry. Do you have any idea if they were hired security officers or just what they were doing at the protest?
I don't have that information. There's no indication at this point in time that they were working for anyone or that anybody had hired them. So at this time, we don't know why they were at the protest.
Okay, thank you, Chief.
Thank you.